welcome to the Adam Smith Institute's fourth coronavirus webinar. In our previous webinars, we've discussed the initial response to the crisis, how we'll all end up as libertarians because of it, and how it affects the future of migration. If you haven't seen those already, I'd strongly recommend going over to our Facebook page or our YouTube channel and giving them a look. Today, we'll be discussing post-pandemic priorities, in particular, rebooting the economy. I'm your host, John McDonald, and I am delighted to be joined today by a fantastic panel. We have Daniel Hannan. He is a prominent Brexiteer and now happily redundant MEP. He is a regular columnist for the Sunday Telegraph, International Business Times, and Washington Examiner. He'll be taking us through how the response to the crisis will significantly affect our political priorities going forward. We're also joined by Johnny Leavesley, chairman of the Midlands Industrial Council and director of the Leavesley Group. His business interests include farming, property, and sale of surplus machinery and heavy vehicles. He'll be talking us through what businesses have done to survive the lockdown and what they will like to see from the government as we try to reboot the economy going forward. And last but not least, we have our own director and co-founder, Dr. Eamon Butler. Eamon has just co-authored a report on reopening Britain, the urgency with which we need to do so. And if you haven't read it, you should do so already. He'll be running us through the economic impact of COVID-19 and what sort of policy prescriptions we will need to move things forward. Just bear with me a minute. Right. So in terms of format, I'm asking our panelists to speak for around 5 to 10 minutes each, uninterrupted, at which point all other panelists should be able to dive in and dissect everything. And before I hand over to the experts, I shall say my piece. I think there are two main conflicting narratives about our post-pandemic priorities. Some think we should have a Hobbesian Leviathan state to protect us all from the ills of the world, and that the government should take a permanently enlarged role in managing the economy and our daily affairs. But I think this fails to acknowledge the dynamism that smaller states have shown, such as Singapore and South Korea, in helping getting the virus under control. We're kind of left with a conundrum. We'll need extensive government intervention in the post-pandemic period to support businesses and protect livelihoods, but we'll also want to avoid burdening the private sector with excessive taxation and regulation. I think in this way, our post-pandemic priorities mirror a sort of Gladstonian desire to both shrink the state, but also make it more effective. We've also commissioned a poll from Survation a few days ago, which shows that there's also strong support for this agenda. 72% of people support a reduction in tax to facilitate strong growth, both of jobs and the economy. On that note, I'd like to pass over to Eamon, and he should be able to run us through some specific policy prescriptions.
Yes, certainly. Well, the situation does in fact look rather dire, I have to say. The OBR recently predicted a 35% fall of GDP in this quarter, inflation, unemployment rising to 7%, the worst in 300 years. That's very much worse than the financial crisis, which everyone's still complaining about, which was only really a 5% reduction in GDP. And there it took at least 5 years to recover. Some people go back to the 1918 to 19 Spanish flu, where GDP, certainly in the United States, dropped about 25%. It did come back, but it took about three years to return. And in the Great Depression, world GDP fell by about 27%, and unemployment doubled. And it took about 4 years really to get out of that one. So it is dire by any circumstances. And although the OBR said that, well, there'll be an almost instant turnaround after a 3-week lockdown, well, we're having a 6-week lockdown. And what our report yesterday said was that a 6-week lockdown is very, very, very much more damaging than the 3-week lockdown. It's a bit like a virus going through the economy. if you catch it early, then it's not too bad. But if you let it go, then it can be disastrous, because one business fails and then that produces failures among its suppliers, and those in turn produce failures on their producers and suppliers. And so it's like dominoes falling, but it's not dominoes falling in a single line, it's dominoes falling in every direction. So the longer you leave this lockdown, the worse things get. And we're looking at massive borrowing, twice as much at least as the financial crash. And it's looking bad. And there are social and psychological problems about maintaining the lockdown as well. Public fear and frustration, psychological harm done to children in particular, but also adults, people who become unemployed. There's already reports of domestic violence and self-harm. The financial crash led to about, it's estimated, 900,000 increase in chronic health conditions. And across North America and Europe, it's believed that there were about 10,000 suicides on account of that. Well, this is very much deeper and it's very much more vicious. So who knows where that's all going to end up. And it's particularly difficult for poorer people who are more likely to lose their jobs, whose jobs mean they can't work from home. They may be in cramped accommodation with no garden, less able to homeschool their children than more better off families. And so it seems to us that there's a very urgent need to get business working again at the soonest time that we can and wherever we can. And I think that we should rely on the ingenuity of businesses. Nobody wants to run an unsafe business or be in an unsafe business. And yet businesses have come up with innovative solutions for social distancing and hygiene, like the supermarkets, for example, who very quickly installed screens in front of their cashiers, stepped up their cleaning, produced lines on the floor, so to help social distancing, and other measures like that. Pretty clever measures which help them to trade in a safe environment. And I think we should probably rely on businesses to do that, rather than put excessive bureaucratic rules on them, telling them exactly how they've got to operate. So as we come out of this, I mean, I think that we need to reinvigorate business, because we're going to end up with a productive system with a lot of holes in it. And we're going to have to create new businesses, entrepreneurial ventures to fill those holes. And it seems to me that you need to stimulate business and get out of its way. I think that we need to freeze VAT and corporation tax and rates for small businesses. It's not a case of the government losing revenue by doing that. They won't have any revenue anyway if they've killed off the business sector. And similarly, I think that there should be regulatory reform. We have bizarre rules on things like, craft brewers were complaining that their business is down by 84%, but they can't deliver beer to the public because they don't have the appropriate licenses. Well, that's just crazy. Why shouldn't that happen? And why shouldn't wholesalers be able to sell to supermarkets and shops, and indeed to individuals as well? They can't do it at the moment because of absurd packing and labeling laws and things like that. So let's just cut out all of this. I think that what we really need is not a more Leviathan state, as you put it, John, but in fact the very opposite, that we need to clear the state out of the way. And I think that as time goes on, we need a real total review as to what the government's doing and whether all these prestige projects it's doing are really necessary. And also we need a thoroughgoing review on the burdens on businesses, particularly small businesses, because we need their flexibility in order to get us through the next phase. So that's my introduction. Want some gremlins,
John,
John?
you're on mute.
On mute. Oh, crikey, that's embarrassing. I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Well, well, I was going to say, what do we make of projects like HS2 then, in light of this need to reduce the Leviathan state, as I called it, going forward in sort of a post-pandemic setting? Sorry to bring out a controversial question at the opening.
That's a typical prestige project, which never really had much justification at the time, but it's a very low marginal benefit project. And I think in this time, we can only do things that have a real and positive and clear and obvious benefit. So I think that things like that will be probably put on ice, because we simply won't be able to afford them.
Okay. So I know we've been looking at we've sort of been poring over the OBR forecasts recently, and why do you think they're sort of painting a more optimistic image than seems to otherwise be the case?
Well, I wish I knew. I mean, they seem to think that things will bounce back within a year. I think that's optimistic. On the historical evidence, it's optimistic. And as I say, in previous recessions, business has at least kept going. We've killed it off, or we've closed it down at least. So there's nothing there to revive. And the more that that continues, then the more unemployment we create, the more businesses we ruin, the more people who are running small businesses decide, well, should I really carry on paying rent on my premises, or do I just throw in the towel? And as time goes on, more and more and more of those do that. So it's an escalating problem. So that's the situation we're in, and I think it's. I can't see why the OBR came to that conclusion. I think that it's, and they were really basing that on a 3-week lockdown. So from 6-week lockdown, I don't think they even contemplated it yet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, and I have one more question before I hope our other panelists can chime in. We've seen people start to talk about longer-term monetary financing. Do we think that sort of thing will rear its head shortly? Do you think we'll see a protracted period?
After any economic shock like this, you need a loose monetary policy, definitely, and I think you also need a loose tax policy. In other words, that you reduce taxes as far as you can. You don't put them up; you put them down. And I think that both of those things are inevitable, and they are absolutely right. And the theory suggests that that's exactly the right thing to do in a recession. And Milton Friedman, who was the arch monetarist, believed that you should increase the money supply after a downturn. Yes.
Okay, I would like to turn over to Johnny Leavesley as someone who is participating very heavily in the business community. If you could fill us in on what sort of measures have been taken to stave off the negative effects of the coronavirus crisis.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I'd start off by talking a little bit about the Leavesley Group and what we're doing and how we're getting through it, and then tell you about business generally, what I picked up, what other people are doing and how they're getting through it. You'll know the theme about that, and it's not a pretty picture really. And then my prescriptions as to how we cope with the pandemic hangover going forward for the economy generally. So I run a small conglomerate with my brother, the Leavesley Group. We're in property. We are landlords of commercial property. We are also commercial property developers and residential developers. We have some trading companies, shipping containers, self-storage, modular offices. We are also involved in agriculture, in arable, in livestock, and in a small manufacturing company of farm equipment. Lockdown for us, the best thing that's happened to us, as for every business, is the furlough scheme, which has been essential not only for maintaining a sort of lifeline to the economy, but enabling us to maintain a core which can continue doing some business. We're no longer very large employers, but we have 20 people currently working full time, and we've furloughed about 50 people. Other forms of government help that we've had, we did apply for two loans, one for a very small leisure business, which we have, and we've already received the £10,000 because we were below the rates liability on that particular business. Another one, which was a petrol filling station, which we have, which is still open. We've received the £25,000, which came through. Both came through the local authority. Both were fairly easy to apply for and came through pretty quickly. We haven't applied for the larger loans. We haven't needed to. My finance director says that we're going to be okay for about 3 months at this sort of rate. We did have a beneficial refinancing earlier in the year, which certainly helped. Every business monitors cash, and we discuss it when normal times in depth, about once a month. Certainly we discuss it weekly. We're at the stage where we're discussing cash on a daily basis, and we are monitoring our debtors. And we have been receiving, we have a tenant base of well over 100 tenants, and we've had about 20 of them apply to us for rent holidays or deferments. At the moment, our policy is to offer help so long as our tenants have already applied to the government for some form of help, and we're offering rent deferments, which are also going to carry no interest, and they seem to have been accepted. I've had the figures in for our group of companies for March, and we were profitable, although turnover was down by about half. We had some interesting pickup in business regarding our shipping container and modular office business, because we had some extra orders coming from local authorities and from several hospitals, who were obviously preparing for the current crisis. That has now stopped. I have no idea really what the figures are going to be like for April, but I'm sure it's not going to be pretty. Our largest debtor is a manufacturer in Birmingham who makes parts for JCB. I'm absolutely certain that, and we're struggling to communicate with them. I'm absolutely certain that they are not working at the moment, and because we know JCB are not producing in this country apart from housing for ventilators, so far as I know. Businesses generally, well, as you know, it's not a pretty picture. They've either stopped completely or they're running at about quarter speed or strength. It's worse, I think, for retail landlords. The public company REITs have suffered a huge reduction in their quarterly income from this quarter. I noticed that, I don't know if you can see that, retail landlords suffer big first quarter rent shortfalls. So the largest retail landlords, Hammerson, Into, New River, Regional and Capital, they're all well below 50% of income collected. That's obviously going to impact institutionally, because a lot of their income would turn into dividends, which goes into people's pensions. This is going to have a catastrophic effect. And the high street wasn't in a good condition anyway. The only uptick I've seen is from the supermarkets. Can you see that headline? Tesco takes back 2 sheds to meet demand. That's warehousing space, one in Milton Keynes, one near Bedford. One of our larger tenants, this is again anecdotal, one of our larger tenants is a vehicle hire business. And in the past month, they've had 2,000 vehicles come off hire, but it's been counterbalanced by 4,000 vehicles coming on hire, and virtually all of those 4,000 vehicles coming on hire are going to supermarkets, presumably for deliveries and for logistics. They've been inquiring of us for extra space. I don't know whether we'll be able to do it quite quick enough for them, but we certainly hope so. Other businesses which I've heard of and have kept in touch with, I know of an aluminium smelter here in the Midlands who has stopped completely. I've heard of construction companies and construction sites and house building that stopped completely. I know of one Birmingham food wholesaler who is extremely busy. I also know of a Birmingham pharmacy wholesaler who is also extremely busy. He claims he's working on low margins. I don't believe him, but he is extremely busy at the moment. But these are just small pockets. Generally speaking, I think people are very worried and they're not doing much. The scale of the problem, I think, is gargantuan. the amount of debt that the government has quite rightly taken on with its various schemes is unprecedented and is almost impossible to put a figure on. Although I noticed one think tank today has come up with the figure of 300 billion. It does depend, doesn't it, whether this is going to last 3 weeks, 6 weeks, or 3 months at this current rate. But we won't know until we get to the other side, and it's almost impossible trying to anticipate what that sort of figure will be. But this debt overhang is going to be with us perhaps for a generation. So we need to do something very radical and brave to try and tackle it. If I were a Treasury Mandarin, I'd be looking at 3 ways of trying to deal with this. And 2 of those 3 ways I don't think are very attractive. One is increased taxation and more austerity. The other one is trying to create some inflation to try and inflate your way out of it. The trouble is about those 2 solutions is that apart from the very short term, they're like opioids, which could destroy the patient in the long term, and extremely unhealthy things to do. In terms of extra taxation, I'm not sure that the patient could actually withstand it, and there's enough capacity in it, in the economy, to actually withstand greater taxation. The best way out of this, in terms of medium and long-term prosperity, is greater economic growth. And now that has been relatively hard to do over recent decades because of general low productivity problems. Now, I know productivity is partly a matter of how you measure it, but, and people on the left would say it's a matter partly of training and the balance of the industries you're in, and people on the right would say it's too much regulation. It's actually a combination of all of those things, combined, I think, with the fact that our currency is too strong. I would like us to have a devaluation of the pound to boost exporting. And that would certainly help with long-term prosperity. If you were an Asian manufacturer and you're deciding where in Northern Europe you want to base your new widget factory, you have to be attractive as a country for many respects in terms of the ease of opening up that factory, but also having a dealing in a currency and selling in a currency which allows you to be attractive at a long-term price point. And that's why when you have increased manufacturing in this country, it gives better incomes to the lower paid, and it increases productivity and our balance of payments better than anything else, better than our service sector could do. Deregulation is immensely important. I think we need to be very radical about that. The examples, Eamon, that you gave, I completely agree with. Initially, we're going to have an unemployment problem. The secret is about the secret truth about deregulation is that quite large companies quite like it because they see it as a barrier to entry. And the fact is, you need deregulation initially for small businesses, because that will give you the most immediate uptick in employment. You want the corner shop to have another assistant. You want the restaurant to be able to take on another waiter, and or more delivery drivers. And therefore, I think we need ease of employment, lower payroll taxes as well. I would like to see national insurance go or be simplified into income tax. I would like to see it levied at a higher rate. Certainly rates, certainly VAT threshold need to rise dramatically. Corporation tax, certainly yes, long-term structurally, I think we should try and aim to be the lowest in the G7. That will certainly help. We need to do all of these things at the same time. In terms of deregulation that I'm especially involved in, I think planning laws are too restrictive, too lengthy in terms of getting planning consents. The process needs to be speeded up hugely. We also need greater ease in being able to get export licenses for manufacturing. A combination of all of those things needs to be done radically. I think I worry about whether the politicians will have the bravery to do this at the scale needed to be doing it and then stick with it for long enough, because they will get a lot of criticism. But I think it's absolutely necessary. So that's largely concluding my remarks.
So on that final note, I wanted to ask all of the panel: do we think the political will is there to take on this sort of agenda? I mean, we've seen, Boris operating on a platform of unleashing Britain's potential. Do we think he can make good on his word to do so now?
I suspect he's the only leader we could have had in these times who might have the bravery to go through with this. I don't know about everybody else who may be advising him. And I don't know what the Treasury may be thinking about it. They would probably go for some sort of combination of public expenditure cuts and higher taxation and trying to stimulate inflation, which is a combination of remedies which I think mainly won't work. That's what worries me.
Okay. Is there a sort of a critical point at which prolonged lockdown would become a sort of an irreversible, irreparable threat to the economy? I mean, you might already think that it is, but is there a sort of a catastrophic slide that would take place?
We won't be able to pinpoint that until it's over, but it's certainly true that the longer it goes on, it will have a magnified effect through the image you gave earlier about a domino not falling down and taking casualties in a straight line, but spreading out. How far it spreads, we don't know until it's over. It's not an experiment that you want to continue with too much on the side of caution, no matter what the public health risks are. I'd say we need to open up as soon as possible.
Okay. Well, on that note, I would like to pass over to Dan Hannan so he can fill us in on what he thinks the effect of the virus will be on our political priorities going forward.
Well, John, thank you very much. And welcome to everyone who's listening in. On your immediate question, is there a point of no return? You know, we're all spending a lot more time looking at these exponential graphs than we were doing a month ago. And I think we are going to be seeing exponential graphs for the collapse of businesses, because that's a geometric problem. I mean, if I predicted that the others would all be in front of bookshelves, so I thought I'd be outside here. I'm in a small village on the Hampshire-Berkshire borders, and if I just tell you what's happening to small businesses here, one by one they're going under. A good example being the osteopath. 300 patients a week to 0 patients a week. A previously very solvent business was growing, employing 20 people, has now had to seek insolvency. And if enough businesses in that category follow him, then when the eventual reopening happens, there won't be any customers. So being allowed to open your doors will be of much less value, a month from now than it would be a week from now. And that's a point that I think hasn't yet been fully appreciated. I agreed with everything that Johnny and Eamon said about what needs to happen. Right? We need to grow our way out of this mess. We need to remove the barriers to growth, both regulatory and fiscal. Of course, we should be having lower business taxes, lower VAT, lower national insurance, etc. The chances of that happening are, to a first approximation, 0. The Hobbesians have it. I mean, I'm afraid public opinion is even more distant than usual from where the ASI consensus might be. And the reason for that is that a change of this, a plague or a perceived threat, flicks switches in our brains. It makes people more authoritarian, more illiberal, and more inward looking. You can see this most obviously in the opinion polls. 89% support an extension of the lockdown. Similar proportion support the immobilization of all so-called non-essential workers, which of course is way beyond what the current government policy in black and white says. And that's very odd, right? I mean, why do so many people positively welcome being bossed around by the state? The answer is, there is if you like, a chemical change, kind of communitarian instinct. Short book by a man called Sebastian Junger called Tribe, which looks at the appeal of a high stress or conflict situation. He interviews a lot of people who were survivors of the siege of Sarajevo. And a consistent theme of their testimony is that they missed it. I don't mean by that they missed the war. They were all very keen to emphasize that they didn't want the shooting back. But they missed the simplicity of life, the way that everyone had an obvious sense of purpose, the way that every neighbor was suddenly part of the family and not a stranger anymore. And his explanation for this is that situations of this kind bring us much closer to our kind of hunter-gatherer tribal roots, to our Paleolithic genomes, to what we were designed for, than a dispersed, wealthy Western society where we live on our own, sleep on our own, in a way that we didn't do for the previous million years. And that's why, I mean, there's no way of getting around this. People rather approve of heavy-handed state interventions at times like these. And my worry is that when the immediate threat of the epidemic recedes, the authoritarianism that it has engendered in people will remain. When the infections themselves have passed, our minds will remain infected, or at least our politics will remain subject to that contagion. In this sense, I suppose we could, I mean, we have to be careful of drawing too many parallels with the Second World War, but I would draw this one. There was a similar authoritarianism for the same reason after 1940. It was unpatriotic to be individualistic. Don't you know there's a war on? Do what you're told. And then as now, there were people who were enjoying it altogether too much. You know, in the phrase of the time, the little Hitlers who took huge pleasure in telling everyone to switch off their lights and so on. And we can all spot people both in and out of police uniforms who are behaving similarly today. Here's the really alarming thing. When peace returned, the government was very slow to relinquish powers which it had assumed on a supposedly emergency basis. So identity cards were not scrapped until 1952. Food rationing wasn't scrapped until 1954. Conscription wasn't scrapped until 1960. And when it came to the various kind of economic control panels and bureaucracies that had been set up to direct the war effort, in many cases, they were not really removed until the 1980s. And you could argue that when it comes to our education and healthcare systems, we still have basically what was designed in a command economy during the first half of the 1940s. So the story of the growth of the state, in a way, can be understood as powers seized on a notionally contingent basis that then remain because they've become the new normal. And I'm very pessimistic about something similar happening. Final point about the Second World War before I let it go. Johnny very correctly said that the Treasury will be drawn either to more tax rises or to more inflation. And of course, after 1945, we both maintained a very much larger state. I mean, it is true, of course, that there was some reduction in public spending with the demobilization, but it didn't go back to anywhere like where it had been before. And successive governments, because we'd emerged with a debt that was more than twice of our GDP in 1945, successive governments, Labour and Conservative, allowed a policy of continuing inflation to try and erode the debt. And this had a massive and deleterious knock-on impact on competitiveness and productivity. And it explained why throughout the 50s and 60s, the rest of Europe, which had, on paper, if you like, suffered much worse during the conflict, had factories bombed and bridges thrown down and so on, outperformed us. They were not dealing with the massive debt that we were after 1945. And I think we eventually reached the moment of collapse in the 1970s after 3 decades of trying to inflate that debt away. By the way, we didn't make the final payment until 2006 for our American loan. So we're talking about significant sums of money. You put all of that together, and I think it is very difficult in politics to make the argument that Johnny and that Eamon were just making for lower tax and lower regulation. A final observation before we turn this over to a general discussion. A lot of people have not yet been impacted in the way that the osteopath here has, or indeed that almost everyone in the private sector has, including Johnny, including me, including everyone who's watching, who is one way or another in business. First of all, of course, there are a lot of people who are not in the private sector. Either they're state employees or their pensioners or their students or whatever. There are then people who are in the private sector but are protected by the furlough scheme. And if the, when you factor in not having to commute to work and stuff, they, in some cases, will have suffered no real reduction in net income. But it will catch up with everybody. And I've noticed this week it's particularly started catching up with journalists. Up until now, for the first 3 or 4 weeks, most columnists, most opinion formers were shielded from most of the effects of the downturn. It's only now that magazines have started to fold, that television channels have started to go under, and that the ones that have stayed in operation have started asking for voluntary pay restraint, or indeed have started laying people off. So I think that may gradually bring it home, but it'll be several steps down the line before that begins to impact the public sector. As Johnny correctly said a moment ago, tax receipts have plummeted just as spending is going up. But the mood in the country at large is, give our NHS heroes a pay rise. People are not prepared to understand yet that the money has run out and that previously sacrosanct budgets are going to have to be looked at again. So you put all of that together, and I'm afraid that I am not optimistic going forward. As the poet Burns says, forward though I cannot see, I guess and fear.
Well, I think I join the rest of the panel in hoping you're wrong, Dan.
I would especially hope to be wrong. And I mean, the only optimistic thing, the one chink of light here, is that there is now a premium on growth in politics. So our previous culture wars suddenly seem unbelievably trivial. Who cares when there's a big thing like this going on, whether the chief medical officer or the chief scientific advisor are privately educated white men? Who cares whether you call it a Chinese virus? Who cares at a time when we may have 1 million, 2 million people unemployed, whether companies are required to publish gender pay differentials and this kind of. So if you like, we're back to the big stuff. There is a premium on getting back to jobs and growth. My worry is that in the public mood, there is far more incentive for the politicians to pursue popular and populist policies of economic nationalism than to try and liberate the economy and get to growth in the medium term.
So I have received an interesting question, which I want to put to you. What do you think this means for Brexit? Do you think it'll radically alter the original foundations of the Brexit project, or do you think we'll leave by the end of the year and we'll continue as we always plan to do?
I'm pretty sure we will leave on time, and we certainly should. Oh well, sorry, we've left, but we should not prolong the transition. I can't help noticing that the people arguing hardest for a prolongation are people who never wanted Brexit in the first place, and they've snatched at almost anything because their Europhilia has become, if you like, a tribal identifier rather than a practical project, right? They're like Jacobites. They have a sentimental attachment to their cause long after it ceased to be a practical possibility. But if you look at it coldly, there is absolutely nothing that could be decided next year that couldn't be decided this year. It's not as though Britain is asking for anything unusual or bespoke. In fact, the EU refused on principle to countenance an unprecedented deal when Theresa May requested one. And so Boris, taking the EU at its word, has therefore said, okay, in that case, let's just do stuff that you've already offered to everyone else in South Korea and Canada and so on. Now, the EU can either accept that or not, right? But whether or not it does is not going to be impacted by whether we wait for 6 more months. They'll make that decision now or they won't. My guess was always that the economic self-interest of the member states, of the other member states, would trump the kind of lingering sense of affronted annoyance in Brussels, and that a deal would be done. And the economic crisis engendered by the epidemic tends to strengthen my conviction. It would really be eccentric to the point of self-absorption at a time like this for the EU to pick a fight with its largest trading partner, its single biggest market, simply because it's still miffed about a 4-year-old referendum. It would be extraordinary at a time when people would be desperate to have London's capital to recapitalize the European financial system if the EU went out of its way to put obstacles in the path of its own business just to prove some point because it was still feeling miffed about something. So I think it would be absolutely wrong from everyone's point of view to delay this project and to add a whole new layer of uncertainty. You know, we're necessarily going to be looking at a restructuring as we come out of this. The companies that spring up on the ashes of the old ones will be slightly different. Necessarily, our supply lines will be a bit different. Our trading patterns will be a bit different. It would be absolutely wrong to ask business to go through all of that and then say, oh, and by the way, at some unspecified point in the future, we're going to ask you to adapt to a different set of trade schedules.
So I wanted to, before I open things up to the Q&A session, we've got many questions, so I want to reserve a bit of time for that. Do we think that we'll need to see, or there'll be political pressure to shorten supply chains? Are we going to see an increase in economic protectionism? So if anyone wants to chime in on that.
I think it's possible, and I think it might even make a certain amount of sense, to be honest. But I hope it doesn't descend into a kind of nationalism as well. But certainly, I mean, I think our supply network is going to be in such poor state that I think people are going to be grasping for any sources of supply. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why the EU thing is very important, that we need the flexibility of being able to buy from abroad and to buy agricultural goods, for example, which, you know, there may well be a shortage of without the EU tariffs. So I think that flexibility will be very important for the future.
I think that there will be an upsurge of protectionism for psychological, not political or economic reasons. People, as I say, become more inward looking at a time like this, become more suspicious of outsiders. I mean, one of my neighbors here keeps on complaining that there are, as she puts it, outsiders using our village shop. And I keep on saying to her, you know, where do you think the food in that shop has come from? You know, it's as irrational to ask for national food self-sufficiency as for, you know, village food self-sufficiency, or indeed national combined harvester self-sufficiency, which we don't have either, right? But people are not thinking rationally. People are thinking with their Paleolithic brains, and they're thinking, oh my God, we're just depending on strangers for this really vital stuff. And yet, if you really want food security, the last thing you should do is to try and grow your own food. The countries that did that up until the 60s were regularly subject to needless famine and shortage, because if you try and produce everything yourself, you're subject to a localized drought or bad harvest or plague or whatever. Whereas if you source your food as widely as possible, then you're always going to have a surplus from somewhere. So, hello, young man. So, you know, if you look at, just to prove that, if you look at the two extremes of this, the country that is most obsessed with food self-sufficiency on the planet is North Korea, right? It is elevated self-sufficiency to its supreme principle, juche. And it's the last place where you still have man-made famines. The other end of the scale, Singapore, doesn't produce one edible ounce itself, and yet it has the cheapest and most secure food supply in the world because it has diversified and varied supply chains. But to be honest, that is a difficult argument to make even in normal times. And I'm afraid I found in conversations with previously fairly reliable free market oriented conservative MPs, it is almost impossible to win that argument at the moment.
Okay, I have one last question for Johnny before I move into the Q&A session, which I'll be asking the questions in as well. I just wanted to know if you think there'll be any sort of permanent shifts in the ways in which we work. We've seen people wanting to work from home more in the instances where they can, and there seemed to be a sort of a general trajectory towards that before all this happens. Do you see any sort of permanent shifts?
Yes, of course. I mean, we've all got used to using Microsoft Teams and Zooms and other facilities for working remotely. but it's not a panacea for full employment. You know, not everybody can work from home.
No, of course.
Directors middleman, and yes, it will have its own improvements and efficiency, and it will certainly cut down on the commute, and it will certainly spread a commute throughout the day. If you can work partly at home and then you can go and attend the office for a meeting, or the other way around even, that will make life a little bit more bearable. But you know, the idea that we can all work from home permanently is nonsense.
Fair enough. I have to agree. Right, I will start running through the Q&A session. So we have a question from Andrew Lillico. He says, you didn't seem to discuss mass debt forgiveness. Johnny, I know you've mentioned that before. If we were really to have an economy 20% or 30%, 35% lower for any length of time, debts taken on in the previous world will have to be totally unsustainable. Surely there would be a key role for government in brokering where the impact of defaults resided. Should free marketeers, I think this is a real question, should free marketeers believe the burden of debt forgiveness should fall mainly on residual claimants, i.e. landowners? Should governments attempt to engineer that result, either via taxes or brokering some form, or brokering of some form, sorry. So anyone wants to dive in on that, that would be fantastic.
It's interesting, debt forgiveness. Well, I'm not an economist, so I presume it would need an almost unprecedented degree of international cooperation. And how it would work, I simply don't know. I seem to remember from history, it didn't work for the late Roman Empire very well. Dan probably knows something about that. It does happen voluntarily and unilaterally, and it's called defaulting. And that's not very good for a country's long-term prosperity because it affects its international creditworthiness. There were some nuances in Andrew Lillico's question just towards the end there about how landlords and other segments of the economy should take a greater burden of it. Did I understand that right?
Yes, I think he was asking if free marketers believe that should be the case.
Probably not, except at the margins, because generally when you start picking out individual interest groups for special treatment or special punishment, it creates imbalances, which is just inefficient. But normally, I mean, Andrew Lillico is quite a respected commentator. He's the sort of person I'd ask for the answer for that, rather than him asking me.
Can I weigh in on this? I mean, I'm also very pro listening to Andrew, but there was something similar in 1945. People acknowledged that what had gone before was exceptional, and there was an international debt reduction and debt forgiveness exercise recognizing that we needed to protect the viability of some of the new regimes. Britain was not a beneficiary of it in general terms, but I think the principle that should govern it, it's a bit like when a company goes bankrupt. When a company goes bankrupt, you don't really worry too much about moral hazard. Your concern is not about who's to blame. Your concern is just to try and get through it as quickly as possible with minimum pain, and to incentivize the creditors to take something rather than to hold out and risk getting nothing. And if a number of governments are effectively bankrupt, I think a similar principle should apply. And that will mean that a lot of people who think that they are owed money by governments will get less than they were expecting, whether as pensioners or as bondholders or whatever. It won't simply be a question of, if you like, overseas debt. I think we're all going to end up getting less than we were expecting. But I think that's true of everybody now. I mean, there's literally no one who can be untouched by a 35% decline in GDP. We're all going to be feeling the impact.
Okay, I have another EU-UK negotiations related question. It says those negotiating are public sector, but Dan, you said earlier that the public sector hasn't felt the hit from the lockdown just yet. Are we sure they'll understand the need for businesses to reduce burdens in EU-UK negotiations now?
I don't think that any of our bureaucrats actually understand that, and I think that one of the if I can counter the pessimism of Daniel, I mean, I think one of the good things as far as a free market supporter is concerned is that there's likely to be a number of people saying, well, we've lost our jobs, we've lost our businesses. You guys, you civil servants, still in your jobs, you're still doing the same thing. You haven't suffered a loss to your pensions or your salary or whatever, and we need a bit of a rebalancing. So I think that there will actually be some focus on that, and I think, as Daniel said, the absolute focus must be on growth, and that's the only thing which is going to get us out of it, because we need innovation, we need investment, and therefore that's the way that we get growth. So I think certainly if they do think, if our negotiators do think that we can flick a switch and things will be returned to normal with no problem at all, I think they should be disillusioned by Boris and his friends very quickly.
Okay, so someone in the question section has asked what we make of the response from Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan. They say that by quarantining people coming in, they solve both problems. They save hundreds of thousands of lives and allow their economy to function as normal, with the exception of traveling internationally. So I think that's a lockdown issue of who can come in and who come out of restricted areas.
Well, they were obviously geared up after SARS. I mean, Singapore had a special hospital built after that last respiratory epidemic. So they were in a different position. That said, I mean, some of these are among my favorite countries, particularly Singapore, and it's a neat demonstration of how you would, despite the left trying to caricature Singapore as some kind of, Dickensian hell, how you would be much better off being poor or ill or elderly or whatever in Singapore than in most Western countries. I do want to raise an issue, though, which hasn't yet come up, which is, Eamon talked about, the difference between a 3-week or a 6-week lockdown, and Johnny said something similar. I wonder whether the incentives for decision makers are slightly skewed here, in the sense that no government, I mean, I mentioned the opinion polls earlier, there is a great premium on being authoritarian, cracking down, being active. No government at a time like this is going to lose support for erring on the side of caution or being too strict. And all of the incentives, it seems to me politically, are pushing people to be more restrictive than the pure science may suggest. And I'd be interested in other people's views on this. I wonder whether what people make of the data that we're seeing increasingly from Sweden, which suggests that the epidemic peaks and declines there in the same way that it has everywhere else, although with fewer infections, without a lockdown. You've probably seen the data that Carl Hennehan, the medical professor at Oxford and the clinical epidemiologist had. He demonstrates, I think, pretty convincingly that fatalities peaked here on the 8th of April, 2 weeks ago. And then if you reverse engineer from there and you say, what's the lead-in time for hospital admissions and the lead-in time for infections, that probably the infections here had peaked some days before the lockdown began. Infections were already falling when the lockdown began, because if you like, our sort of Swedish measures of just washing your hands a lot and not going to the pub and so on were enough to have caused that peak. Now, if that's the case, I would love to think that people would delightedly grab at the data and say, great, fantastic, we don't need to be as restrictive as we thought, that let's start opening up. But human nature being what it is, I have a terrible fear that there will be a kind of sunk costs phenomenon, an unwillingness to admit that all the sacrifice was for nothing. And therefore people will say, well, we can't decide yet. We've got to be sure. We've got to make sure that we have all the data before we do any more loosening. That seems to me to be reversing the burden of proof. If you can't be sure, your default assumption should be to act less rather than to act more. But again, in the current climate, I think that's an almost impossible argument to win.
This is one of the reasons why we propose that we should actually have some economists on SAGE. SAGE is entirely stuffed with physicians, and so are the committees that feed into it. But if you're advising the government, yes, in order to quell the virus, we've got to lock down the economy, there are economic consequences of that as well, and social consequences. So you must, it seems to me, involve economists in the decision, and there's no shortage of very good economists. I mean, Patrick Minford or John Vickers or Roger Bootle or Mervyn King, Paul Ormerod, all of these people could tell the decision makers that yes, okay, you may want to shut down the economy for that clinical reason, but there are consequences of doing so, and you should be very aware of the bad consequences of doing so.
Okay, so last question before I try to round things out. We have a question saying there has been a stigma against large businesses or larger businesses that could afford not to take the furlough grants for employees but have chosen to do so. Football clubs, for example, are easy targets. Should the government assistance be available for all or only those who need it?
I think in the stage when they were announcing something, they needed to do it quickly. They needed to do it big and bold. The longer this goes on, I hope it doesn't go on, then they can get better nuanced, and perhaps the criticism implicit in that question could be nuanced to be fairer. But for the initial stage, I think they just had to announce it and make it large. That was the important thing. There wasn't time for subtlety.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Right. Well, in that case, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it. We did have an awful lot of questions, 84 questions, so I'm very sorry to everyone who asked a question who I couldn't get round to. We are, however, taking suggestions on the Adam Smith website. If you pop over right now, you should see a splash page that invites you to provide your suggestions and questions to us. We'll also be hosting a webinar next week, so make sure you tune in for that as well. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next week.